Harrow Creek, Montana Territory, 1887. The town of Harrow Creek sat at the bottom of a wide river valley where the cottonwoods turned gold in September and the wind came down off the mountains, cold and clean enough to make your eyes water even on a clear morning. It was the kind of place that asked something of every person who settled there, and most people either gave it willingly or left by their second winter. Lena Aldgate was 27 years old and had given Harrow Creek everything she had. She was at the front porch of her small house that Tuesday morning in late September, mending shirts that belonged to other families, her needle moving quick and precise through faded cotton while the cottonwoods shed their first leaves into the yard around her. The house had belonged to her and Douglas properly, and legally for 3-year Douglas went down to check the irrigation channel on an October evening 9 months ago, and didn't come back. Dolan Pryce was 48. He'd come to Harrow Creek the previous spring with a modest herd of cattle, a leased parcel of grazing land 4 miles north of town, and the kind of unhurried, deliberate way of moving through the world that some men earn through patience and others through loss. In Dolan's case, it was both. He'd lost his wife Eleanor to fever 11 years back in Wyoming when his youngest was still too small to remember her face. He'd raised 3 sons in the years since, worked their ranch until the boys were old enough to take it over themselves. And then, with something that looked like restlessness from the outside and felt, from the inside, more like a man following a quiet but insistent pull towards something he couldn't yet name, had sold his share of the Wyoming operation and come west to Montana. He first saw Lena Aldgate through a stand of cottonwoods on his way into town 6 weeks after arriving in Harrow Creek. She was hauling water from the well, both arms working, not asking anyone for help and not appearing to expect any. He rode past without stopping that day, and the next, and the one after that. By the 4th week, he stopped at her fence. "Morning," he said. Lena looked up from the porch, her needle still in hand. She was 27 years old and had the kind of face that would have been easy to overlook at a glance and impossible to overlook once you'd looked once properly. Practical, direct, with something steady behind the eyes that hadn't been broken by 9 months of managing grief and laundry and legal correspondence alone. "Morning," she said, and waited. Dolan Pryce. Got the leased parcel north of the Deming Road. Didn't mean to stare. Just noticed your fence boards working loose on the east side. Lena set down her mending. "I noticed it myself last week. I've got spare boards and an afternoon free Thursday if you'd allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. 48, she thought. Weathered in the honest way, not the hard way. There was a difference, and she had learned to read it. "I'll allow the boards," she said. "I won't allow you to think it means anything beyond boards." Dolan nodded, the way a man nods when he's been told something fair and knows it. "Understood, ma'am." He came Thursday, fixed the fence, and left without lingering. He came back the following Monday with a basket of apples from a neighbor's tree, set it on the porch step, and rode on before she'd come to the door. Lena stood holding the basket in the morning light and felt, for the first time in 9 months, something she hadn't been able to name clearly enough to decide whether to be grateful for it or afraid. She decided, for the time being, to be neither. Dolan Pryce was not a man who explained himself easily, but he was a man who showed up. That much became clear to anyone in Harrow Creek paying attention that autumn. He showed up Thursday mornings with the fence boards. He showed up the week after, with a neighbor's extra load of split firewood, and asked her where she wanted it stacked. And listened to the answer. He showed up on the morning she was struggling with the latch on her barn door, fixed it in 10 minutes with a piece of wire and a 1/2-inch nail, and said not one word about it that could be taken as anything other than simple neighborliness. What he didn't do was push, didn't stay longer than the task required. didn't ask personal questions she hadn't opened the door to. Lena was 27 years old, and she had spent 9 months being the object of other people's sympathy, most of it genuine and some of it not. And she had learned to tell the difference between a man who wanted something and a man who was simply, quietly, present. Dolan Pryce, she was starting to conclude, was the second kind, which made him, in some ways, more difficult to know what to do with. It was 6 weeks into that autumn, the mountains already showing their first snow on the highest ridges, that Lena said something she hadn't said to anyone. They were sitting on the porch steps after he'd helped her move a waterlogged trunk from the back room. Not a romantic arrangement, simply a practical one, 2 people resting after a heavy piece of furniture, when she said it. Douglas went to check the irrigation ditch on a dry evening, she said. September 12th, the kind of evening where you can see all the way to the mountains. Dolan was quiet, listening. He took his hat, his vest. He left his tall boots by the door. She paused. Douglas never went to the irrigation channel without his tall boots. Never once in 3 years. The channel runs muddy even in dry weather. He knew that. He hated wet feet. Dolan turned that over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone he hasn't seen before. The boots were still by the door when I came back from the Holloway's place that evening, and he wasn't there, Lena said. He'd been in the river. They found him a mile downstream. The coroner said he'd slipped checking the channel edge. She was looking at the mountains, not at Dolan, when she said the next part. A man who forgot his tall boots before walking the muddy irrigation channel in the dry season, she said quietly. I've never been able to make that into an accident. Neither could Dolan. He didn't say so aloud that evening. But he held on to it, the way you hold on to something small that doesn't fit and keeps pulling at your attention, no matter how much other work there is to do. Royce Aldgate arrived at Lena's door 4 days later. Royce was 44 years old, Douglas's older brother, and had the particular bearing of a man who had convinced himself somewhere in his 40s that every inconvenience he experienced was an injustice specifically aimed at him. He dismounted in the yard without apparent hurry and came up the porch steps without apparent invitation, and Lena, who had seen him twice since the funeral and liked him neither time, held the door and waited. Territorial Land Office responded to my inquiry, Royce said. Lawyer says the homestead claim Douglas filed is complicated by the fact that the original survey was done before your marriage. Land claimed before a union, with no children to inherit directly, has precedent for reverting to blood family rather than a surviving spouse. Lawyer says it's not certain, but it's arguable. Lena kept her voice flat and even. Douglas built this house himself. We broke this ground together. I know that, Royce said, with a tone that suggested he found the fact unfortunate but irrelevant. I'm not saying it isn't hard. I'm saying the law's got its own opinion about what's hard. I'd rather settle this between us than let some territorial judge settle it in a courtroom. Sign the property over to me. I'll see you something fair in return. Enough to get yourself relocated. Denver, maybe. You've got family in Denver. I have a cousin in Denver I've met twice, Lena said. Still, Royce looked around the yard. You're 27 years old. This isn't a life for a young woman on her own. Be practical about it. Lena watched him ride away afterward and stood in the yard long enough for the dust to settle entirely. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about a pair of tall boots standing by a door on a dry September evening, and a man who had just used the word practical in the same sentence as asking her to sign away everything Douglas had built. There was a particular kind of urgency in Royce Aldgate's voice that didn't match a man simply waiting patiently on a legal process. She found herself thinking about that long after the sun went down. I've been telling stories a long while now, and this one has already traveled further than I expected when I first sat down to write it. People have found their way to Harrow Creek from places I never imagined. From the coast of California, from the hills of Tennessee, from countries I can only find on a map if I look careful. If you're spending this evening with Lena and Dolan, I'd be grateful for a like on your way through. It helps a story like this find the next person who needs it. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment. I read every one of them, and it still surprises me every time how far these evenings travel. Now, a pair of boots left by a door. Dolan Pryce has been turning that over in his mind since the evening Lena said it, and he's about to find out that the answer is considerably worse than either of them was hoping for. Dolan Pryce was 48 years old and had worked alongside enough men in his life to know the difference between one who left a job quietly for honest reasons and one who left because he'd seen something he didn't want to be responsible for knowing. He found Chester Boone in the next county over, working a small sheep operation that barely covered his expenses and looking, when Dolan arrived at his door, like a man who had been waiting 9 months for someone to ask the right question. Chester was 51. A former hand on the Aldgate place, and had left Douglas's operation within 3 weeks of the funeral. "I didn't say anything at the time," Chester said. "I told myself it wasn't my business and that I'd misread what I saw in the dark, and that a man who argues with Royce Aldgate without evidence on his side generally ends up with considerably fewer prospects than a man who keeps his mouth shut." Dolan waited. Chester looked down at his hands. "I was coming back from the south pasture around dusk on September 12th. Took the river trail because the grass was tall enough to trip a horse on the ridge path. I saw Royce Aldgate at the river bend, the one closest to the irrigation channel. And I saw Douglas. He stopped. Douglas was in the water already. I thought for a moment he'd slipped and Royce had gone in to help him. But Royce wasn't in the water. He was standing on the bank, watching." The silence stretched between them. "You went in after Douglas," Dolan said. Chester nodded. "By the time I got him to the bank, it was too late. He'd been in the water a while already. And when I pulled him out, he stopped again. His wrists. The marks were there, the kind a rope leaves. Not deep, not long, but they were there." "Did you tell the coroner?" "I mentioned it. The coroner looked, said it was consistent with him grabbing at brush or rocks on the way downstream. Said drowning accidents happen. Said a man who slips in a river doesn't always go easy." Chester's jaw was tight. Royce Aldgate was standing right there when the coroner said it, nodding along like a man listening to a weather report. Dolan rode back toward Harrow Creek with a particular kind of weight on him that he recognized from moments in his life when he'd learned something that couldn't be unlearned and that asked something of him he hadn't entirely decided he was ready to give. He was ready by the time he reached Lena's fence. He told her that same evening. Lena sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, the way she'd sat at that same table 9 months ago when Sheriff Wallace Dent had come to the door, and she listened to every word Dolan said without interrupting once. "Rope marks," she said when he'd finished. Her voice had gone to a place below ordinary quiet. "Chester saw them himself. He's not a man with any reason to fabricate it." "No," Lena said, "he's not." She looked at the table. "I've spent 9 months telling myself I was imagining things. That the boots by the door meant nothing. That I was a grieving woman looking for something to blame that had a human face instead of just bad luck." She pressed her fingers against her closed eyes for a moment. "I wasn't imagining it." "No," Dolan said simply, "you weren't." She was quiet for a long while. The kitchen got dark around them, and neither of them reached for a lamp, and Dolan stayed the same way he'd been showing up all autumn, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary, just remaining present in it. "Why would Royce do this?" she finally said. It wasn't quite a question. "I went to the land office before I came to you," Dolan said. "There's a survey request filed 8 months before Douglas died. Not in Douglas's name, Royce's name. Assessment of the irrigation land and the river acreage bordering it. Lena looked up. Northern Pacific put out inquiries last year, Dolan said. They want water rights and flat access land for a rail spur through this valley. The kind of land Douglas's property sits on is worth 10 times what it was 2 years ago to the right buyer. Royce knew it. He filed that survey under his own name because he already knew what he was planning to do. Lena sat with that, the full shape of it, the boots by the door, the urgency in Royce's voice when he'd told her to be practical, the legal claim he'd manufactured from an obscure precedent nobody in this territory had needed before he needed it. He came here and offered me relocation money, she said, her voice gone very quiet. Like it was a kindness. He needed you out before the railroad inquiry went formal, Dolan said, before anyone looked too carefully at what he'd filed and when. Lena stood up from the table abruptly, walked to the window, and stood with her back to him for a long moment, looking out at the dark yard where the cottonwoods moved slightly in the wind. When she turned back around, her face had settled into something harder and clearer than grief. "I want to go to Wallace Dent," she said. "I thought you might," Dolan said. "I'll go with you." It was 3 days later that Chester Boone arrived in Harrow Creek and repeated, in Sheriff Wallace Dent's office, every word he'd told Dolan in his kitchen. He was 51 years old, and he sat in the wooden chair across from the sheriff's desk and spoke in the flat, even voice of a man who had been carrying something for 9 months and had decided, finally, that the weight of it was no longer his alone to manage. Wallace Dent was a careful man who did not like to be wrong, and he had been wrong about Douglas Aldgate's death, and he knew it plainly by the time Chester finished speaking. "I took Royce's word on the bank conditions," the sheriff said. "He was family. He was standing right there, and I was looking at a drowned man, and the easiest answer was the one that let everyone go home." He looked at Lena directly. "I'll do better than I did the first time, Mrs. Aldgate. That much I owe you." Royce was brought in for questioning 2 days later. Dolan and Lena sat in the hallway outside the sheriff's office and listened to the particular sound of a story that had held together for 9 months, beginning to come apart under the weight of a rope mark and a survey filing and a ranch hand who'd finally decided his conscience cost more than his caution. Royce did not confess easily. He argued and deflected and suggested that Chester Boone was a man with a grudge and an unreliable memory. But the survey filing was dated 7 months before Douglas died, filed under Royce's name on land he had no legal claim to, and that was a fact that didn't bend to argument regardless of how Royce framed it. When the full shape of it finally became undeniable, Royce sat back in the sheriff's chair and let the silence carry him a long moment. "The railroad was going to make that land worth a fortune," he said at last. "And Douglas didn't even know it. Didn't have the first idea what was sitting under his own feet. He was going to sell for whatever fair price they offered, because Douglas never in his life drove a hard bargain." The bitterness in his voice was old and rancid. "I spent my whole life watching Douglas get things he didn't fully understand the value of." "So you took it from him," Wallace Dent said. Royce said nothing further. Lena, sitting in the hallway, heard the silence from behind that door and felt something shift in her chest that was not triumph and was not relief, but was the specific exhaustion of a truth finally landing after a long fall. She had known something was wrong. She had known it from the boots by the door. She had told herself for 9 months that grief was making her see patterns in coincidence, and she had been right the whole time. And the rightness of it didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. She wept that evening for the first time since the first week after the funeral, sitting on her own porch steps with the mountains dark against a sky full of stars. And Dolan Pryce sat beside her and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. "I couldn't let myself grieve him properly," she said when she could speak again. Every time I got close to it, there was another letter from Royce's lawyer, or another neighbor offering advice I didn't ask for, or another morning of shirts to mend so I could keep the lights on. I never had room to actually sit with losing him. The real Douglas, not the mystery of how he died, but the man himself. The way he hummed when he was working. The arguments we had about the best way to set irrigation gates. The morning he showed me how to read the river level by the color of the sandbars. Grief needs space, Dolan said. You've been fighting on too many fronts to give it any. I have space now, Lena said. It's strange to say that tonight, after everything today was, but I do. She looked at him in the starlight. 48 years old, this man. A face that had learned how to hold both sorrow and steadiness in the same expression, without either one canceling the other out. Thank you, she said, for taking the boots seriously. You took them seriously first, Dolan said. I just helped carry the question until you were ready to ask it out loud. The territorial court moved quickly, once Royce Aldgate's charges were formalized. The land claim he'd constructed from obscure precedent collapsed entirely in the face of his own criminal proceedings. A man convicted of engineering his brother's death to acquire property had no standing to claim that property through inheritance law, and the court had no difficulty seeing that plainly. The homestead reverted to Lena Aldgate fully and without contest. The Northern Pacific Railroad's formal offer arrived 6 weeks later. It was for the water rights and the river-adjacent acreage only, not the house or the farmland itself, and the figure was large enough that Lena sat with it for 2 full days before she trusted herself to think about it clearly. She negotiated when she finally responded, insisted on a water access easements that preserved the irrigation channel for any neighboring farms, and held firm on it until the railroad's representative agreed, which took 3 separate meetings and a patience she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. Dolan came by the morning after the final agreement was signed and found her at the porch steps, not mending shirts for other families, but reading a surveyor's map of her own property spread across her knees in the morning sun. It's done, she said. I heard. Word travels in Harrow Creek. He sat down on the step below hers, the way he had that autumn evening when she'd first said the thing about the boots, and they sat together for a while in the comfortable silence that had become, without either of them officially deciding on it, one of the ordinary textures of their days. I've been thinking, Dolan said. I noticed, Lena said. You get a particular look. There's a look? Around the eyes, like you're checking fence posts in your head. Dolan smiled slightly. He was 48 years old, and he had not smiled easily in a long time before this autumn, and Lena had started to notice that about him. The slow return of it, the way it changed the whole quality of his face when it arrived. I'd like to ask you something, he said, though I want to say first that whatever you answer, I understand it, and it doesn't change anything that's come before. Lena set down the surveyor's map and looked at him. I came to Harrow Creek looking for something I couldn't name, Dolan said. 50 miles in every direction from that Wyoming ranch, and nothing had felt right in 11 years of trying. I rode past your fence 6 times before I stopped. I didn't stop because I was looking to matter to someone. I stopped because the fence board was genuinely loose, and I had the boards, and I couldn't ride past knowing about it one more time without doing something about it. I know, Lena said. But somewhere between the fence boards and the apples and the firewood, something else happened, he said. Something I wasn't looking for and wasn't expecting and wouldn't have asked you to accommodate when you were still carrying all of what you were carrying. He was quiet for a moment. You're 27 years old. I'm 48. I know that's a thing worth saying plainly. I'm aware of my own age, Lena said, and yours. I imagine you are. He turned to look at her directly. I am asking, Lena, not because you've got a railroad settlement and a cleared homestead, and I think this is the moment to press the point. I'm asking because you finally have the ground under you to make a choice that's entirely yours, without survival making it for you, and I want to know, when you're standing on ground that's entirely your own, and nobody's forcing your hand, what you want. Lena looked at him for a long moment. The morning was clear and cold, the mountains showing white all the way down to the middle ridges now, the cottonwoods finally bare, the river audible in the distance the way it always was on still mornings. My mother told me once, she said, that the man worth choosing is the one who shows you who he is before he has anything to gain from showing you. She picked up the surveyor's map, folded it once along a crease that was already there. You fixed a fence board. You stacked firewood and didn't wait for me to thank you. You asked Chester Boone the question nobody else thought to ask, and you drove 4 counties to do it, and you didn't tell me until you had something worth telling. Lena, Dolan said. Yes, she said, and looked at him fully. That's my answer, Dolan. Yes. They were married in March, when the snow had come off all but the highest peaks, and the river ran high and cold, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first pale green at the tips of their branches. The whole of Harrow Creek turned out, the way small towns turn out for a thing that feels somehow like it matters to all of them, not just the 2 people standing at the front of the church. Chester Boone stood in the second pew with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally said the right thing at the right time and was at peace with the cost it had taken him to get there. Sheriff Wallace Dent stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and anyone watching his face during the ceremony would have seen something in it that looked very much like a man honoring a debt he could never fully repay, but intended to spend the rest of his career trying to. Lena used a portion of the railroad settlement to establish a fund with the county court, dedicated to ensuring that coroners' findings in remote rural areas could be formally reviewed by an independent examiner when a surviving family member raised a documented concern. It was not a large fund, and it did not change the world overnight, but over the following years it quietly changed a handful of specific facts in ways that mattered to a handful of specific families, and that, she told Dolan one evening, was enough. She kept Douglas's tall boots. Not out of bitterness, and not as evidence. The trial was over, and the truth was settled. But because they had been the first honest thing she'd trusted when everything else was asking her to accept a comfortable version of what happened, she kept them in the corner of the bedroom, and when her children asked about them years later, she told them that sometimes the truest thing in a room is the thing that doesn't fit the story everyone else is telling, and that it takes a particular kind of courage to believe what you know even when the people around you are very certain you're wrong. Dolan built onto the house himself, a proper kitchen addition and a long porch that caught the afternoon sun and faced the mountains. He became known over the years as a man who paid his ranch hands fairly and kept his word on a handshake, and he served 2 terms on the county land board, where he had a particular attention to disputes involving surviving spouses and contested homestead claims that his colleagues found useful, if occasionally inconvenient. He and Lena rode out to the river bend on the anniversary of Douglas's death every year, not to mourn, exactly, but to remember. The way you return to a place, not because it holds grief, but because it holds truth, and truth, even the painful kind, is worth tending to. The mountains above Harrow Creek stood the same through all of it, patient and indifferent in the way that only very old things can manage, watching whatever joy or sorrow played out in their shadow and remaining exactly as they were regardless. Lena had learned to love the view from the river trail again. It had taken time. Most of the things worth having do. There's a particular kind of quiet courage I've always admired, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that shows up in small, ordinary actions before anyone knows what it's building toward. Dolan Pryce fixed a fence board. He asked a question nobody had thought to ask. He sat beside a woman in the dark and said nothing when nothing was exactly right. And Lena Aldgate trusted the thing she knew, those boots by the door, even when 9 months of grief and legal pressure and loneliness were telling her to let it go and accept the simple story. That kind of courage, the small and daily and unglamorous kind, is, I think, the most real kind there is. Thank you for spending this evening in Harrow Creek with us. Wherever you are tonight, whatever you're carrying, I hope this story found you at the right moment. May God bless you and keep you. Until the next story brings us back together, keep writing.